Hey y'all, I'm Jay, and I'm back again with yet another session of Making Things with Framer X. You know, there is a lot that's happening in the world around us this week. I'm gonna choose to focus on one unequivocally positive development, and that is that a couple days ago, a new version of Framer X came out. First and foremost amongst the updates that shipped with this version is the addition of a brand new page tool. What this means is that Frameristas have a really easy way to build swipe interactions without a single line of code. That doesn't mean that a couple lines of code can't make things interesting. So today, I'm gonna use this new tool to prototype a stories interaction by mixing up the Framer X page tool with some code overrides. I'm going to begin at the end here for a moment and show y'all what we're about to build. It's a prototype of this stories interaction, and it uses Framer's page tool and a couple of other elements. You can tap to advance, or you can tap over here to the left to go back, and your progress through the story is visualized in this bar across the top as you take in this influencer-worthy content. Getting started in Framer X, I cheated a little bit and I already created some of the UI and brought some images in for the prototype we're about to build. I got these 6 photos from a trip that I went on about a month ago. Feel free to replace these if you're following along, or just enjoy a behind the scenes look at my world. And then I built this header already and dropped it into a device. I want to take a quick look at how this is set up. There's this frame called Story UI, which groups these purely static elements, the attribution, the XGlyph, the background wash, all together. And then there's another frame called Story Bar, which contains these 6 segments across the top. We'll come back to this Story Bar in a bit. The first thing that I'm going to do is select this page tool and draw myself a page. Right out the box, this page tool can do a bunch of things. I can connect a couple of my photos to it. I'll open up the preview here so I can play with this. I can already swipe through them one by one. I can change the direction that they're laid out. I can change how the content fills the space and how it's aligned. I can adjust the spacing between pages and the padding around the entire container. As just one example, it's pretty easy to go from the default edge-to-edge setup to a design that gives you a peek that there's content on either side like this. I'm going to take this page and bring it over to the devices frame. I'm going to resize it so it fills the device, and I'll get rid of all this padding, and then I want to make sure it's also behind the story UI. If you look at the preview, we've already got something that's pretty decent, so we could stop here, but I want to get this bar along the top working. This is where I'll start getting into code override, so I'll select the container frame called Story Bar and create a new file using the code tool. I'll readjust the windows so we can see everything that's going on, and now we got Framer on the left and got code on the right. So I'm going to clear out most of this example code except for this first line, and what I want to do is first get each segment of the Story Bar and turn all their opacity down. Whenever I go forward or back between pages, I just want to light up the right segment. Now, by the way, this is going to use the same basic technique that I use to keep track of tabs in my tab navigation tutorial video. So if you haven't seen that, I'm going to use this moment for a bit of self-promotion. Maybe you want to watch that sometime. Anyway, first I'll set up a variable where we store all the segments. Then I'll write an override function called Story Bar with a single line that takes all of the children of the Story Bar and puts them into the segments array. Back in Framer, I'll attach this to the Story Bar container. Next, I'm going to create another override function and call this one Story Segment. In a moment, I'll attach this to each of the 6 segments. By default, I'm going to want each of the segments to have an opacity of just 0.2 or 20%, and I could set that directly in this return statement, but I'm going to put it into a variable. You'll see why in a second. Now I'll go attach this to each of the Story Bar segment, and we'll see in the preview that now they're all dimmed out. I'm also going to create a new data object, and in here I'll add a value called current segment, which will be null by default. This will store the ID in just a minute of the currently lit up segment. And now I'm going to create just one more override function and call this one story. It's the one I'll attach to the page component in just a minute. The same way we'd listen for an on-tap event, we're going to listen for an event that pages emit called onChangePage. Whenever the page changes, I'm going to want to update the current segment. And the way I'm going to do this is that I'm going to use the index of the current page to find the right segment in the array of segments that I stored in the first step, and then grab its ID from its props and just hang on to that. I can attach it to our page real quick over here in Framer. And then the last step is to go back to our story segment override and add just one more line. If the ID value that the page just dropped in a data current segment, if it's equal to this segment's ID value, then the opacity of this segment should be 1 because we want to light it up to show which part of the story we're on. Over here in the preview, it looks like it's pretty much working, so that's rad, except when this thing initially loads, or if I refresh it, my first segment doesn't light up. That's just another one-line addition to the story segment override. If data.currentSegment is null, it'll just get set to the ID of the first segment that this override's applied to, and that's exactly what we want. So this is looking pretty good, but all this swiping is just really hard work. I don't want thumbs to get tired, and these should just work like most Stories products. I just want to be able to tap to advance and even just tap on the left part of the screen to go back. To make this happen, we'll create two big invisible buttons over the entire screen that'll capture tap events. These will increment or decrement the current page. I'll draw a big frame over 2/3 of the screen, which will be what we tap to advance, and then a smaller one over the remaining portion, which we'll tap to go back. Now I'll make both of these transparent, and we'll create two more override functions, one for each of these. The first one, we'll call it tap to advance, and it'll do just one thing, which is listen for a tap event and then increment a value in our data object called current page index, which means we actually need this value in our data object, so I'll go at it right now and give it a default value of 0. I'm also going to write a tap to go back override function that does the exact opposite of tap to advance. It decrements instead of incrementing data.currentPageIndex. And there's one more thing to do. Our page needs to be aware of this data.currentPageIndex value so that it can update to the right page in our story as that value changes. Pages have a property called current page, and up here inside the return statement of the story override, I'll set that current page property to the current page index. And now I can go back to the canvas in Framer and attach these override functions to their respective buttons. When I play around with this thing in the preview, it looks like I got myself a tappy little story. There are just a couple of details that can be improved even further. One thing that we might want to do just for good measure is to make sure that since we only want tapping and don't want swiping, that we disable any input from registering on our page component. Since the invisible buttons cover everything, we don't exactly need to do this in this prototype, but I was excited to learn that you can also set CSS styles using overrides. There's also one big thing that's broken still, which is that you can actually increment the page forever. Doesn't seem like that's a big deal, but if you wanted someone to use this prototype, it might feel broken, since the back taps or the forward taps won't actually do anything when you're outside the bounds of the number of pages that exist in our stories page component. I can fix this by making sure that our current page index isn't higher than the number of segments that we have in our tap to advance override, and then doing the same thing, but just making sure that it's greater than 0 in our tap to go back override. If you want to dissect the Framer project, you can find that link in the description. And I just want to say how stoked I am that at least a few people have found these videos useful already. Truth be told, part of me is doing this just as a forcing function to give me a very public reason to learn the tool, and the fact that anyone's finding this valuable, it's such a great bonus. So thank you, and I'll see y'all soon.